The wind howled outside as the waves crashed against the shore. The Admiral Benbow Inn, a small, quiet place by the sea, stood alone against the storm. Inside, young Jim Hawkins wiped the counter, listening to the wind rattling the windows. The inn was nearly empty that night, with only his mother in the kitchen and a few travelers resting by the fire. Then, the door burst open with a loud bang. A tall, rough-looking man stood in the doorway. He was dressed in an old tattered sea coat, and a heavy sea chest sat behind him. His face was scarred, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the room as if searching for something, or someone. Jim swallowed hard. The man stepped forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. He had the look of a sailor, but not the kind Jim had seen before. This man was different. He looked dangerous. "Is this a quiet place, boy?" the man asked in a deep, gravelly voice. Jim hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Very quiet." The man grunted, seemingly satisfied, and dragged his chest inside. He turned back to Jim and tossed a gold coin onto the counter. "I'll be stayin' here, lad. Keep me a room ready. And mind this, if ever you see a man with one leg, you tell me at once. Do you understand?" Jim nodded again, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Yes, sir." The man grinned, showing a row of broken, yellowed teeth. "Good lad. Call me Captain. That's all you need to know." With that, he grabbed his chest and heaved it up the stairs, his heavy boots thudding with each step. Jim watched him disappear, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jim's mother came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who was that?" she asked. "He calls himself the captain," Jim said. "And he paid for a room in gold." His mother frowned. "Strange man. Keep an eye on him, Jim." The days passed, and the captain became a familiar presence at the inn. He was a quiet man, keeping to himself most of the time, but when he drank, he would sing loud, rough sea songs and tell wild stories about life at sea. Jim listened closely whenever he spoke, fascinated by tales of distant lands, buried treasure, and fierce battles with pirates. One evening, the captain sat at a corner table, staring at his mug of rum. Jim approached to refill his drink when the captain suddenly grabbed his wrist. "Boy," he said in a low voice, "you remember what I told you? About the man with one leg?" Jim nodded quickly. The captain leaned in closer. "If ever he comes, you run to me. No matter what." Jim swallowed nervously. "Yes, Captain." The captain released him and took a deep drink of his rum. "Good. You're a sharp lad." Jim hurried away, unsure of what to make of the warning. One cold morning, a stranger arrived at the inn. He was thin and pale, his clothes ragged. He moved carefully, as though he was watching his back. Jim was sweeping the floor when the man entered, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the captain. The stranger grinned, revealing rotting teeth. "Billy Bones," he said loudly. The captain froze. His face turned pale, and his hand gripped the table so tightly his knuckles went white. Jim stepped back, feeling the tension in the air. "I thought I'd find you here, Billy," the man continued. "You've been hidin' a long time. But the crew, they ain't forgotten." The captain stood slowly, his voice low and dangerous. "You've no business here." The stranger chuckled. "Oh, but I do. You know why I'm here. The black spot is coming, Billy. And you know what that means." The captain's eyes flashed with anger. "Get out. Now." The man laughed and stepped back toward the door. "They'll be comin' for you soon, Billy. You can't run forever." With that, he disappeared into the night. The captain stood still for a long moment, his breathing heavy. Then, without a word, he grabbed his bottle and took a deep drink. Jim watched him, knowing that something terrible was coming. He just didn't know what. The night was cold and quiet. Outside the Admiral Benbow Inn, the wind howled, and the sea waves crashed against the rocky shore. Inside, Jim Hawkins sat near the fire, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. The inn had been quiet for days. The captain, Billy Bones, had been sick, lying in bed upstairs, mumbling to himself. He rarely came down now, and when he did, he only asked for more rum. Jim had started to feel uneasy. Ever since the captain arrived, strange things had been happening. He spoke of old enemies and seemed to always be looking over his shoulder. Now, as Jim sat by the fire, he had a strange feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the inn. Jim froze. It was late, too late for visitors. His mother had already gone to bed, and the few guests had retired to their rooms. The knock came again, harder this time. Whoever it was, they weren't going to leave. Jim took a deep breath and walked to the door. He peeked through the small window and saw a dark figure standing outside. The man was tall and thin, wrapped in a long, ragged cloak. In one hand, he held a wooden cane, and his face was covered in shadows. "Boy," the man called in a rough voice. "Open up. I bring a message for Billy Bones." Jim hesitated. There was something about the man that made him uneasy. His voice was calm but dangerous. Still, he couldn't refuse to open the door. Swallowing his fear, he unlatched it and pulled it open slightly. The stranger stepped forward. The dim light of the inn revealed his face, pale, thin, and covered in scars. But what startled Jim the most was that the man was blind. His eyes were covered by a black cloth, yet he moved with confidence, as if he could see everything. "Where is he?" the blind man asked. His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Jim hesitated. "Who?" The blind man gave a cruel smile. "Billy Bones. You know who I mean, boy. Take me to him." Jim felt his heart pound. He wanted to refuse, but before he could say anything, the blind man reached out and grabbed his wrist. His grip was strong, cold like iron. "No tricks, lad," he whispered. "Take me to him." "No." Jim nodded quickly. His hands trembled as he led the man inside. The inn was silent except for the crackling fire. The stranger's cane tapped lightly against the wooden floor as they walked up the stairs. Jim pushed open the door to the captain's room. Inside, Billy Bones lay on the bed, his face pale and sweaty. His breath was heavy, his hands trembling. When he saw the blind man, his eyes widened in horror. "Pew!" Billy Bones croaked, his voice weak. The blind man grinned. "Aye, Billy. You didn't think we'd forget about you, did you?" Billy Bones tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. He clutched his chest, breathing heavily. "What do you want?" he whispered. Pew took a step forward and pulled something from his cloak. It was a small, round piece of paper. He held it out toward Billy Bones and let it fall onto his chest. "There's your message," Pew said, his voice cold. "You've got till sunset." Jim looked at the paper. It was a small black circle, no words, no markings. Just a dark spot. Billy Bones' face turned even paler. His hands shook as he picked up the paper. "The black spot," he muttered. "They've given me the black spot." Jim didn't understand, but he knew it was something terrible. The captain looked like he had just seen a ghost. Pew chuckled darkly. "That's right, Billy. The crew's coming for you. Better make peace with yourself." With that, Pew turned and tapped his cane against the floor, walking swiftly out of the room. Jim watched in silence as the blind man disappeared into the night. For a moment, there was silence. Then Billy Bones let out a groan and clutched his chest. His breath came in short gasps, his body trembling. Jim rushed to his side. "Captain?" Jim asked, his voice shaking. Billy Bones grabbed Jim's hand tightly. "Listen to me, boy," he gasped. "They're after my sea chest. They want the map inside. You mustn't let them have it." Jim felt his heart race. "What map?" Billy Bones tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. He groaned in pain, his grip on Jim's hand loosening. "Flint's treasure," he whispered. "It's hidden. They'll kill for it." Then, with a final gasp, Billy Bones fell back onto the bed. His eyes stared at the ceiling, lifeless. Jim stepped back in shock. "Captain!" No answer. Billy Bones was dead. Jim stood frozen, his mind racing. The captain had spoken of a treasure, of men who would kill to find it. And now, with him gone, Jim knew the pirates would come looking for the map. He turned toward the sea chest in the corner of the room. His hands trembled as he reached for the lock. What had the captain been hiding? Jim knew one thing for certain: the adventure was only beginning. The sea stretched out endlessly under the bright moonlight as the Hispaniola drifted silently across the waters. The ship was large and sturdy, built for long journeys, but tonight something felt wrong. Jim Hawkins, hidden behind some barrels near the deck, held his breath as he listened carefully. A group of sailors, led by the cunning Long John Silver, stood together in the shadows, speaking in hushed tones. Their voices were low, but the words carried enough meaning for Jim to understand. "Gentlemen," Silver said, leaning on his wooden crutch, "our time is near. Captain Smollett and his lot think they're still in charge, but the treasure is almost within reach. Once we land, we take control of this ship, and the gold will be ours." The men murmured in agreement. Some clenched their fists, others nodded with greedy smiles on their faces. Jim felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected something was wrong, but now he had proof. The crew was planning a mutiny. One of the sailors, a rough-looking man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "And what about young Hawkins? He's always snooping around. If he finds out, we'll have trouble." Silver chuckled and waved his hand dismissively. "Leave the boy to me. If he causes problems, he can take a nice long swim." Jim's heart pounded. He had to warn Captain Smollett and Dr. Livesey before it was too late. Carefully, he began to back away, making sure not to make a sound. But just as he turned to slip away, his foot hit a loose plank, making a small creaking noise. "What was that?" one of the pirates snapped, turning his head. Jim froze. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't see him. Silver narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, scanning the darkness. "Probably just the ship settling," he said after a moment. "But keep your eyes open. We don't want any surprises." Jim took the chance to slip away, moving as quietly as possible. His heart raced as he made his way toward the captain's cabin. Inside the captain's cabin, Captain Smollett was studying the map, while Dr. Livesey and Squire Trelawney discussed their plans. Jim burst in, his face pale with fear. "Captain," he gasped. "It's Silver and the crew. They're planning a mutiny." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Are you certain, Jim?" Jim nodded quickly. "I heard them myself. They want to take over the ship and steal the treasure once we reach the island." Dr. Livesey exchanged a worried glance with the squire. "This is worse than I feared," he murmured. "We should have never trusted that man." Captain Smollett stood up, his expression serious. "We have to act fast. Jim, how many men are loyal to us?" Jim thought for a moment. "Only a few, the ones you picked yourself. The rest are with Silver." The captain clenched his jaw. "Then we'll have to prepare for a fight. We must secure the weapons and be ready when the time comes. We'll hold the ship until we reach the island, and then we'll deal with them." Jim swallowed hard. He had known there was danger, but now it was real. The men he had sailed with were turning against them, and soon there would be a battle. The next morning, the ship reached Treasure Island. The crew was restless, eager to get ashore. Long John Silver, playing his usual friendly role, grinned and spoke cheerfully to the captain. "Captain, the men are itching to stretch their legs. Permission to go ashore and scout the land." Captain Smollett eyed him carefully. He knew Silver was up to something, but he had no choice but to let them go. "Fine, but only in small groups." Silver nodded and began organizing the men. Jim watched as the pirates gathered supplies, whispering among themselves. He knew they were planning something. He couldn't let them out of his sight. Determined to find out more, Jim decided to sneak onto one of the boats heading ashore. As the boat hit the sand, Jim quickly slipped away into the trees. He had to find a way to stop the mutiny before it was too late. The island was wild and full of thick jungle. Jim moved carefully, stepping over roots and pushing through the brush. Then, voices caught his attention. He crept forward and saw Silver and his men gathered in a clearing. "Listen up," Silver said. "Once we get our hands on the treasure, we take the ship and leave Smollett and his men behind. If they fight back, we deal with them." Jim's stomach turned. He had to warn the others, but before he could move, a hand grabbed his arm. "Gotcha," a pirate growled. Jim struggled, but the man held him tight. Silver turned, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "Well, well," he said, stepping closer. "What do we have here?" Jim Hawkins, sneaking around where he shouldn't be. Jim tried to keep his voice steady. "You won't get away with this, Silver. Captain Smollett knows what you're planning." Silver's grin faded slightly. "Is that so? Well, Jim, that puts me in a bit of a pickle. What am I to do with you now?" Jim's heart pounded. He had been caught, and now he was at the mercy of the most dangerous man on the ship. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. The battle for the Hispaniola had begun. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden light over the thick jungle of Treasure Island. Jim Hawkins wiped the sweat from his brow as he followed Long John Silver and a handful of pirates through the tangled undergrowth. They had been searching for hours, using Captain Flint's old map to guide them to the buried treasure. The excitement in the air was heavy, but Jim felt uneasy. He knew Silver was dangerous, and he didn't trust the pirates surrounding him. Finally, they reached the clearing marked on the map. A giant tree, its roots twisted like an old man's fingers, stood at the center. Beneath it, according to Flint's map, was the treasure they had all been searching for. Silver's eyes gleamed as he leaned on his crutch. "Well, lads, we've found it. Dig, you dogs. Dig like your lives depend on it." The pirates, eager and greedy, rushed to the spot and began digging with their hands and shovels. Dirt flew into the air as they worked furiously, their muscles straining. Jim stood back, his heart pounding. Something didn't feel right. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The hole grew deeper and deeper, yet there was nothing. No glint of gold, no wooden chest, nothing but dirt and stones. One of the pirates, Morgan, threw down his shovel. "It's not here," he shouted, his face red with frustration. The others murmured in agreement, looking at Silver with suspicion. "You said the treasure would be here, Silver," another growled. "Where is it?" Silver's grin faltered. He scratched his chin, his eyes darting from the empty hole to the map in his hands. "It should be here. It must be here." Jim's heart was racing now. He knew something had happened to the treasure. Suddenly, from the edge of the jungle, a voice called out. "Looking for something, are ye?" Everyone turned. There, standing on a rock with a wide grin, was Ben Gunn, the strange man Jim had met earlier on the island. He was ragged, dressed in old sailor's clothes, and his hair was wild, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. Silver's expression darkened. "Gunn, what do you know?" Ben Gunn chuckled and hopped down from the rock. "Oh, I know plenty, mate. You see, I found O.L. Flint's treasure long ago. Dug it up, little by little, carried it to my cave. Been sittin' on it for years." The pirates gasped. Silver's jaw clenched, but he forced a smile. "Now, Ben, be reasonable. That gold belongs to all of us." Ben shook his head. "Oh, I don't think so, Silver. You and your lot had your chance. The treasure's safe where it is, and none of you are getting a piece of it." The pirates roared in anger. They turned to Silver, gripping their weapons. "You led us here for nothing," Morgan shouted. "We've been tricked." Before Silver could react, the pirates turned on him. Jim stepped back as chaos erupted. Silver, always quick to think, swung his crutch at the nearest man, knocking him down. He reached for his pistol, but before he could fire, the pirates lunged at him. "Jim, run!" Silver shouted, just as a fight broke out. Jim didn't need to be told twice. He turned and dashed into the jungle, branches whipping against his arms and face. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of fighting, shouting, cursing, and the clash of steel. After what felt like forever, Jim burst out onto the beach, gasping for breath. There, waiting by a small boat, was Captain Smollett, Dr. Livesey, and a handful of loyal sailors. Dr. Livesey rushed forward. "Jim, are you all right? Where's Silver?" Jim panted, pointing back toward the jungle. They found out the treasure was gone. The pirates turned on Silver. Smollett nodded grimly. "Then we must leave now. Get to the boat." Jim hesitated. "But what about Silver?" The captain's face hardened. "Silver made his choices. We can't wait for him." Jim climbed into the boat, his mind racing. As the sailors pushed off from the shore, he turned for one last look at the island. He didn't know if Silver had survived, but deep down, He had a feeling that the cunning pirate would find a way out. As they rowed back to the Hispaniola, Jim felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and the knowledge that he had just lived through an adventure he would never forget. Treasure Island had given up its secrets, but Jim knew that some legends never truly die.